African at the moment. The United States has reinforced Nigeria's security efforts with the delivery of key military supplies to Nigerian security agencies. In a statement shared on X today, the United States Africa Command, AFRICOM, confirmed that U.S. forces delivered critical military equipment to their Nigerian partners in Abuja.
Something unusual happened around Nigeria, and it was done quietly on purpose. No Nigerian press briefing, no American victory speech. Just the U.S. military cargo arrived in Abuja, while questions went unanswered. Not what was delivered, not why, not under what conditions. That silence matters, because this delivery did not arrive during calm weather. It came after U.S. missiles crossed into Nigerian territory. It came after Washington accused Nigeria of moral failure. And it came as instability from a broken Sahel crept south, threatening to redraw Nigeria's security map. This is not a story about insurgency alone. It is about who gets blamed, who gets pressured, and who gets to define Africa's crises from afar. Nigeria is being pulled into a familiar Western script, but this time, it is not playing along quietly, and that changes everything. Let's get into it. The moment did not announce itself as history. There were no sirens, no urgent speeches, no emergency vote at the National Assembly. Instead, military cargo arrived in Nigeria's capital, quietly handed over under the banner of cooperation. A short message from the United States Africa Command confirmed that essential military supplies had been delivered to Nigerian partners in Abuja. No list, no quantities, no explanation of what essential actually meant, just a statement designed to sound ordinary. But nothing about this moment was ordinary. Military logistics do not move this discreetly unless there is pressure behind them. Weapons are not delivered without context, and they are never delivered without intent. In Africa's recent history, quiet shipments have often followed louder actions that governments would rather not spotlight. That pattern matters here because this delivery did not come during a lull. It came after force had already been used, after accusations had already been made, and after Nigeria had already been placed under a Western microscope. The silence surrounding the shipment was not about efficiency, it was about control. When powerful states want to shape a narrative, they don't always speak first. Sometimes they let logistics speak for them. A delivery framed as support subtly establishes hierarchy. One side supplies, the other receives. One side explains, the other is expected to comply. Even when sovereignty is respected on paper, optics do the quiet work of redefining relationships. Nigeria understands this better than most. It has spent years navigating partnerships that promise security while quietly expanding influence. That is why the absence of detail matters more than the delivery itself. AFRICOM routinely publicizes training missions, humanitarian airlifts, and symbolic equipment transfers. When it refuses to specify what was delivered, it signals that the materials are not symbolic. They are operational. This is where the story stops being about aid and starts being about power. Because military supplies do not arrive in a vacuum. They arrive after assessments have been made in Washington, after decisions have been taken behind closed doors, and after conclusions have been reached about what a partner country can or cannot handle on its own. In that sense, the delivery was not an opening move. It was a follow-up. And Nigeria was not confused about that. Abuja did not celebrate the shipment. There was no triumphal language, no public gratitude, no political attempt to frame it as salvation. The Nigerian state treated it as a technical event, not a moral endorsement. That restraint was intentional. African governments have learned that public enthusiasm can be read as consent to deeper involvement, and Nigeria has no interest in surrendering narrative control over its own security challenges. This moment, then, was not about equipment. It was about positioning, about who leads, who follows, and who gets to define what comes next. The delivery looked small, but it sat on top of something much larger, something that had already crossed Nigeria's borders before a single crate touched the ground. So the real question is this: what happened before these supplies arrived that made silence the safest language for everyone involved? What happened before the supplies arrived was force, used quietly, decisively, and far from where most people were looking. On Christmas Day, the United States confirmed missile strikes inside Nigeria. Not advisory support, not intelligence sharing. Actual kinetic action. and the location immediately raised eyebrows. Sokoto State. Sokoto is not the symbol most outsiders associate with Nigeria's insurgency. It is not Borno or Yobe, where groups built their notoriety. Sokoto sits on Nigeria's northwestern edge, pressed up against the Sahel. That geography is the key. Because what Washington struck was not a Nigerian origin threat in the classic sense. It was a moving threat, one displaced by the collapse of security arrangements across Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, where Western military strategies failed, withdrew, or were expelled. When those structures fell apart, fighters did not vanish. They adapted. They crossed borders. They followed arms routes and smuggling corridors that predate modern states. Nigeria did not invite that instability. It inherited it. This is the part often missing from Western accounts. Nigeria's northwest did not suddenly radicalize in isolation. It became exposed. And exposure is what happens when regional fires are left to burn until the wind changes direction. Sokoto was not chosen by chance. It was chosen because it sits where Sahelian disorder meets Nigerian territory. By striking there, Washington implicitly acknowledged something uncomfortable. The Sahel crisis is no longer containable. It has spilled south, and Nigeria is now absorbing the shock. But instead of publicly framing the strike as a response to regional failure, the United States acted as if it were correcting Nigerian weakness. That distinction matters, because it determines who is blamed. And blame shapes everything that follows, from diplomacy to aid to pressure. If Nigeria is portrayed as incapable, intervention feels justified. If Nigeria is recognized as a frontline state dealing with imported instability, the conversation changes entirely. Abuja understood this immediately. Nigerian officials were careful with their language. They clarified that the targets were linked to Sahelian networks, not domestic insurgent command structures. That clarification was not defensive, it was corrective. It redirected attention away from Nigeria as the source and back toward the wider regional collapse that created the conditions for violence to move. But Washington did not amplify that nuance, and it did not need to. The strikes had already done their work. Once missiles land, the narrative space shifts. Attention moves from causes to responses, from history to urgency. And that is exactly when military supplies arrive, framed as stabilization rather than consequence. Seen this way, the delivery to Abuja was not reassuring. It was normalization. It signaled that U.S. action inside Nigeria was now part of an accepted security routine, something to be followed by logistics, coordination, and quiet alignment. And that raises the deeper issue. If the strikes revealed how Nigeria became a frontline for a crisis it did not create, why did Washington already have a political storyline ready to frame Nigeria as morally at fault rather than strategically burdened? The storyline was already written before a single missile crossed Nigerian airspace. Long before the strikes in the Northwest, Donald Trump had publicly framed Nigeria as a country failing a moral test. In October, he accused armed groups in Nigeria of persecuting Christians and went further, claiming that Christians were victims of a genocide that Nigerian authorities were allowing to happen. It was a heavy word, chosen not for precision but for impact. The problem was that the claim did not match reality. Nigerian officials rejected it immediately. Independent analysts rejected it just as clearly. Nigeria's violence does not follow a clean religious divide. Muslims are killed. Christians are killed. Civilians are targeted by criminal gangs, insurgent splinters, and bandit networks driven by money as much as ideology. The crisis is messy, regional, and structural, not a simple morality play. But Trump's accusation was never meant to explain Nigeria. It was meant to position it. In American politics, moral framing comes before force. Once a country is portrayed as negligent or complicit, external action can be sold as responsibility rather than interference. Military pressure becomes protection. Sovereignty becomes conditional. The accusation clears the ground so later actions look inevitable. That is why the timing matters. Trump's claims came first. The strikes came later. The logistics followed after that. Each step reinforced the next. By the time missiles hit Sokoto and equipment arrived in Abuja, Nigeria had already been placed in a defensive posture, not militarily, but narratively. This framing also served another purpose. It shifted attention away from Western responsibility for Sahel instability. Instead of asking why armed groups were moving south after security collapses in Mali and Niger, the focus became Nigeria's alleged moral failure. Instead of examining regional blowback, the story narrowed to Abuja's supposed inaction. That narrowing is powerful. It simplifies complex history into blame. And blame is easier to manage than accountability. Nigeria understood what was happening. That is why it never adopted Trump's language, never echoed his accusations, and never allowed the crisis to be redefined as a religious war. Accepting that framing would have meant accepting responsibility for a narrative designed elsewhere. African governments have learned this lesson the hard way. Once you accept the moral indictment, everything that follows, sanctions, pressure, and intervention, becomes harder to resist. Nigeria chose a different path: correct quietly, refuse loudly. But this also put Abuja in a tight position. It still faced real security threats. It still needed cooperation. And it still had to manage a powerful partner that had already decided how the story should sound. Which leads to the next move in this sequence. When Nigeria refused to echo the accusation, it did not confront Washington directly. Instead, it responded with something far more strategic: silence, precision, and selective acknowledgement. So how exactly did Nigeria push back without escalating? And what did it deliberately choose not to say when the pressure intensified? Let's pause for a second to say big thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel, you're becoming part of a powerful cultural movement. Let's continue. Nigeria pushed back by refusing to give Washington the one thing it wanted most: confirmation. There was no public endorsement of the U.S. strikes, no repetition of Trump's accusations, no dramatic language about rescue or intervention. Instead, Abuja responded with precision. Officials clarified that the fighters targeted in the northwest were linked to Sahelian networks, not domestic Nigerian insurgent command structures. That single clarification quietly dismantled the narrative that Nigeria's crisis was the result of internal moral collapse. Then came the most telling move. In early January, Nigeria said its security cooperation with the United States had been strengthened. And then it stopped talking. That phrase was carefully chosen. It acknowledged coordination without defining its limits. It accepted a partnership without conceding authority. Most importantly, it avoided confirming whether Nigeria had approved future U.S. strikes on its territory. In diplomacy, ambiguity is not weakness. It is insulation. Nigeria created space to benefit tactically while protecting itself politically. This was not accidental restraint. African states have watched what happens when foreign military involvement is publicly celebrated. Praise becomes permission. Gratitude becomes leverage. And what begins as support slowly turns into expectation. Nigeria avoided that trap by treating the episode as technical rather than transformational. Silence also served another purpose. It prevented escalation. Directly confronting Washington over the strikes or Trump's rhetoric would have shifted the story toward confrontation, allowing the United States to frame itself as challenged rather than overreaching. Nigeria denied Washington that opening. By refusing to argue publicly, Abuja kept the focus where it belonged, on the facts, not the drama. At the same time, Nigeria did not deny the reality of its security challenges. It did not pretend the threat was imaginary or manageable alone. It accepted logistics. It coordinated quietly. It allowed cooperation to continue, but on its own terms. That balance is difficult to maintain, especially when dealing with a partner as powerful and politically volatile as the United States. This approach reflects a broader shift in African diplomacy. Confrontation is no longer the default response to pressure. Control is. Governments now understand that the loudest reaction often gives away the most ground. Silence, used strategically, keeps options open and narratives unsettled. But Nigeria's restraint also created an unusual situation. While Abuja said little, Washington said even less. The U.S. confirmed the delivery but refused to specify what equipment was transferred. No categories, no capabilities, no scope. That mutual silence was not a coincidence. it was a negotiation conducted without words. And here is where the story tightens. When both sides refuse to name details, it usually means the details are sensitive. One side is protecting sovereignty, the other is protecting flexibility. And when flexibility is protected in military affairs, it often signals that future actions are still being considered. Which brings us to the most revealing question of all. Why did Washington feel the need to hide the specifics of what it delivered if this was truly just routine support? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. Washington hid the details because details create limits, and limits were the last thing it wanted. When military assistance is genuinely routine, it is described openly. Training programs are named, vehicles are listed, timelines are shared. The United States Africa Command does this all the time across the continent. Transparency is used when the message is a reassurance. This time, there was none. That silence tells us the delivery was not symbolic. It was functional, and more importantly, it was sensitive. Militaries only obscure shipments when the capabilities involved change operational balance, intelligence fusion tools, surveillance assets, targeting support systems, communications infrastructure, or logistics that enable rapid follow-on action. Naming such equipment would immediately raise questions about intent, scope, and future use. So Washington chose not to name it at all. This is not speculation, it is pattern recognition. By keeping the contents vague, the United States preserved freedom of action. It avoided public debate about escalation. It avoided questions about consent. And it avoided being boxed into a commitment it might later want to reinterpret. Silence here was not diplomatic courtesy. It was operational insurance. For African states, this tactic is familiar. What begins as support quietly shifts into dependency when technical systems, intelligence pipelines, and operational rhythms start aligning around an external partner. Control does not arrive with troops on the ground anymore. It arrives through integration, quietly, efficiently, and reversibly only on paper. Nigeria understands this risk. That is why Abuja mirrored Washington's silence. By refusing to publicize or praise the delivery, Nigeria avoided legitimizing an expanded role it did not publicly define. It accepted the capability without advertising alignment. This was not indecision, it was containment. But the broader implication is uncomfortable. If Washington felt the need to hide what it delivered, it suggests the United States sees Nigeria not just as a partner, but as a theater where future options must remain open. Options that may not yet be politically defensible, but are being prepared for, technically. And that exposes the real imbalance in this relationship. Nigeria is dealing with a threat that migrated into its territory after regional systems failed. The United States, meanwhile, is positioning itself to respond on its own terms, with its own narrative, and with minimal public accountability. The aid in this sense is less about empowering Nigeria than about preserving American strategic flexibility. This is where the story stops being about insurgency and starts being about control over pace, perception, and permission. Who decides when action is necessary? Who defines success? And who bears the political cost when things go wrong? Nigeria has tried to answer those questions through restraint, through ambiguity, through refusing to validate someone else's storyline. But restraint only works when both sides respect its purpose, which leaves one final issue unresolved. If Africa is no longer willing to be framed, pressured, or quietly absorbed into someone else's security agenda, what does that mean for the way power is going to be exercised on the continent next? It means power in Africa is no longer exercised through noise, it is exercised through refusal. Refusal to echo narratives, refusal to accept blame for crises created elsewhere, refusal to turn cooperation into confession. Nigeria's response to this entire episode makes that clear. It did not reject assistance, but it rejected interpretation. It did not deny the security threat, but it denied the story attached to it. And that distinction marks a shift that Washington, especially under Trump's worldview, struggles to understand. For decades, Africa was expected to react loudly, either with gratitude or protest. Both were useful. Gratitude signaled submission. Protests justified pressure. What Nigeria did instead was more destabilizing to the old playbook. It controlled tempo. It allowed logistics to pass without spectacle. It allowed cooperation without endorsement. And it allowed Washington to speak while quietly refusing to repeat a single line. That restraint is not weakness. It is a leverage adapted to a world where overt defiance invites punishment, but quiet non-alignment limits control. Nigeria understood that arguing with Trump's accusations would only amplify them. Silence denied them oxygen. Precision corrected facts without escalating tone, and ambiguity protected sovereignty without provoking confrontation. This is what an African agency looks like in 2026. It does not announce itself. It does not beg for validation, and it does not accept moral lectures from politicians who need African crises to feed domestic narratives. Trump's approach relies on endurance. Let the facts stand. Let the contradictions surface on their own. The irony is that the United States now finds itself constrained by the very silence it chose. Refusing to explain the strikes clearly, it invited scrutiny. Refusing to list the equipment, it raised suspicion. By accusing Nigeria first and coordinating later, it exposed the sequence of intent. And by trying to control the story, it revealed how much it needed that control in the first place. Africa is watching this carefully, not just Nigeria. Other states understand the lesson being demonstrated. You can cooperate without surrendering authorship. You can accept help without accepting hierarchy. And you can deal with insecurity without allowing it to be weaponized against your legitimacy. This does not mean the old pressures will disappear. They won't. But it does mean they will be less effective. The more African governments master this kind of calibrated response, the harder it becomes for external powers to impose meaning along with assistance. In the end, this episode was never really about missiles, or cargo, or even insurgency. It was about who speaks first, who defines reality, and who gets the last word. Nigeria chose not to shout. It chose not to explain itself to an audience that had already decided what it wanted to hear. And that leaves a final, uncomfortable question hanging in the air. When Africa stops reacting and starts controlling the narrative through silence, how long before outside powers realize they are no longer directing the conversation at all? Let us know in the comments section. Should Nigeria speak up? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.